plan for in case people are sick and can't make it to class. I hope nobody's sick yet, and I hope nobody's planning to get sick, but I'm going to see if that works as a backup plan. I'm not entirely certain on what that's going to look like or how bad it is. Just give me 1 second. Yeah, we're gonna do an experiment with that. So I believe that where we got to yesterday was that you told me that you know what the proton mode of force is. Is that right?
Yeah.
You want me to draw it out on the whiteboard, or does that sound painful? Sounds painful? Okay, if you are comfortable with the proton mode of force, then I'm certainly ready to get on and start looking at the course content of microbiology. Well, the course content starts out pretty easy, so we're not going to get too deep into it right now. I guess that what's on the next few slides you already know from your biology classes, but it's always good to review. So microbiologists consider that there are three broad categories of microorganisms. So these are the big, totally different groups of microbes, and the first one is, of course, the eukaryotes. Those are microbes that have a eukaryotic cell structure, and hopefully you are familiar with eukaryotic cells. After all, you are made up of eukaryotic cells yourself. If I had to ask you what the one absolute defining feature of the eukaryotic cell is, what would you tell me?
The nucleus.
It's really the nucleus, right? Which is a membrane-bound organelle. It's the nucleus. That's what makes something a eukaryote rather than being a prokaryote. So the membrane-bound nucleus, absolutely. That's the difference between a eukaryote and a prokaryote. By definition, a eukaryote is a cell that has a membrane-bound nucleus and stores its genetic material in that membrane-bound nucleus. Of course, eukaryotes also have the membrane-bound organelles. If you take a look at this, this textbook artist's diagram of a eukaryotic cell, there's lots of different membrane systems like the Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum, and so on. And then those two really important organelles for energy generation called the mitochondria, and in plants, the chloroplasts. And those are things that prokaryotes just don't have, right? So those are also defining features of the eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells have a complex internal organization in comparison to prokaryotes. Like in a eukaryotic cell, there's all these different things in here, and they are all where they're supposed to be. And they move around at different times of the cell cycle. So that tells us that the eukaryotic cell is highly organized. The different pieces are in a certain place where they're supposed to be. And we're going to hear in a second that it's not totally untrue of bacteria and prokaryotes, but they just don't have the internal organization that the eukaryotes have. Division by mitosis and meiosis. I'm sure you heard all about mitosis and meiosis. You heard about it to death in biology class, right? You're not going to learn about mitosis and meiosis again in here, I promise you. I just bring that up for one reason, and it's because people spend so much time learning about that in biology class, they don't realize that mitosis and meiosis only apply to eukaryotes, right? Because when you learn about mitosis and meiosis, you learn all about these different events that were going on in the nucleus, right? The organization of the chromosomes and what happens with the nucleus. Well, bacteria don't have a nucleus, so they can't do either mitosis or meiosis. We're going to see that their cell division is much simpler than that. Biologists like to, categorize things into different layers of groups. So our big group is the eukaryotes, and now we're going to break that into some successively smaller groups, right? We can break eukaryotic microbes into two categories. The first being the protists, which are unicellular or multicellular without differentiation into tissues. Some examples that I'm sure you are aware of, right? If we're gonna we can then further break the protists down into smaller groupings, like the protozoa. Protozoa are the animal-like microorganisms. There was a time when they kind of thought that they were gonna be more closely related to animals. They're not. but they're animal-like microorganisms because they kind of have the same behavioral characteristics, right? Like, here's an example I'm sure you're familiar with. It's called a paramecium. It's a single-celled eukaryotic microorganism, but it swims around using these cilia on its outer surface. So it kind of looks like it behaves like an animal, and it eats stuff to get its energy, so that kind of looks like an animal as well. So people kind of call the protozoa the animal-like microorganisms. The second group of protists are the algae, and if protozoa are the animal-like microorganisms, then algae are the plant-like microorganisms, right? They are the photosynthetic plant-like microorganisms. Here is an example of a filamentous algae, right? Each cell is a complete compartment that works on its own, but they grow in this filamentous, kind of multicellular structure. So this is kind of like the beginnings of multicellularity in the algae. Slime molds and water molds are also grouped inside the protists. Gonna be totally honest with you, I don't know anything about slime molds or water molds other than this picture right here. Apparently that's what a slime mold looks like. And they used to get categorized with the fungi because they sort of look like fungi and behave like fungi, but then in the genetic age, we like to look at organisms' genetics, and when they looked at the genetics, they said, oh, these aren't fungi at all. They group with the other protists, so slime molds and water molds now go in the protist category. The second major group of eukaryotic microbes then is the fungi. And fungi come in lots of different shapes and sizes. They can be unicellular, in which case they are called yeasts. They can be filamentous, like this penicillium in the picture. That's a filamentous fungus, in which case they're referred to as molds. And they can be multicellular in some cases, like a mushroom is clearly a multicellular organism. It's differentiated into tissues. And the reason why I didn't break these into 3 different bullet points like I did for the protists is that they're not really separate. In some cases, fungi can do all 3 of these things, right? They have complex life cycles, and there are lots of fungi that spend some of their life as a yeast, and they spend some of their life as a mold, and then when they want to reproduce themselves, they go and grow a big, huge multicellular mushroom, and they disperse spores, and they use that to reproduce themselves. So fungi do some of them do all 3 of these things, some of them spend their entire life as yeasts. This course is mostly going to be about the second category of microorganisms. And the second category is the prokaryotes. If the defining feature of the eukaryote was the nucleus, that's what you told me, what's the defining feature of a prokaryote?
Lack thereof.
It is the lack of a nucleus. Prokaryotes do not house their genetic material inside of a membrane-bound nucleus. Prokaryotes are visually simple, which is why microbiologists rely on metabolic, biochemical, and genetic properties to classify them. Right? Here are a couple of pictures of prokaryotic cells, and you just don't see that complex internal structure inside of it. You don't see a nucleus, you don't see any organelles. You do see some different regions, but they are simple in comparison to eukaryotes. So prokaryotes have no membrane-bound nucleus or organelles. They are generally much smaller than eukaryotic cells are. Like a typical bacterium might be just 1 micrometer in diameter. They have a relatively simple internal structure in comparison to eukaryotes, right? They don't move their mitochondria around because they don't have mitochondria. And let's just remember that those 2 terms, mitosis and meiosis, apply only to eukaryotes. So when we learn about cell division in bacteria, which we will, we're going to call that something else. We're going to call it binary fission. Basically just means 1 cell divides into 2. There's no events in the nucleus because they don't have any nucleus. Most, I would say, the overwhelming majority of bacteria and prokaryotes are unicellular. But one of the things I would like to point out to you is that this list of characteristics of the prokaryote, these are not hard and fast rules. They are well accepted guidelines. Let's put it that way. I think that you've all heard of a bacterium that is not unicellular, at least not all the time. Anybody remember a picture we looked at yesterday? Started with an M, They were called
myxobacteria.
the myxobacteria. The myxobacteria form complex multicellular fruiting bodies at some point in their life cycle. They do it when they run out of food. So this is not a hard and fast rule. We will hear about bacteria that divide by other means than binary fission. So most of them use this thing called binary fission that we're going to learn about in this class, but definitely not all of them. They are believed to have a simple internal structure, except that's not always true. There are some bacteria that have those cytoskeleton-like features similar to the eukaryotic cells. So once again, it's a guideline, not a rule. And although they are generally smaller, sometimes there's a few really strange ones that are way, way bigger. In fact, just a couple of months ago, somebody published on a strange bacterium that can be like 5 or 6 millimeters in length. You know how long that is? Like half of the width of a dime. That's absolutely, like one single cell is absolutely visible to the eye. So while the vast majority of bacteria are much, much smaller than eukaryotes, I don't like to slap any hard rules on bacteria because they always break the rules. There's a few of them that do not follow that. No membrane-bound nucleus or organelles. Well, that one is still a pretty good solid rule, except that might not last that much longer because people are starting to find strange bacteria in strange parts of the world that do house their DNA inside some kind of a membrane-bound compartment. It's not called a nucleus yet.